You looked around lately and seen that peace seems to be an elusive quality in our world today. Whether we're looking at the Middle East or in Asia, or even right here in our own community. I read this week about a group of enthusiastic peacemakers. 1,200 had gathered in Los Angeles. And this group wanted to make a statement about the futility of war and the importance of peace. That sounds like something worth getting together for. But before they had gone too far, the peace march stalled out. Half the group disbanded because they were bickering within the group. And those who remained, well, part of them decided they wanted to go on in vehicles, and the other part wanted to march on foot. And then somebody said, shouldn't we have a dress code? And they started bickering about that. It got so bad that they came to an agreement that they should vote on how they're going to organize their peace march. And then somebody said, well, do the children get to vote? And then they started arguing about that, and they finally came to a consensus, and they voted. And as soon as the vote was done, somebody declared it invalid. Well, it kind of went downhill from there. And pretty soon, most of the people who had come together to march for peace were not even talking to each other. Yeah, and Jim Burton, who's reflecting on what happened a couple of years ago in an article on the web, described this event, saying, and we wonder why our nations can't get along. We're Advent people, and we do wait for peace. Yet in thy dark street shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. Remember at the beginning we sang that? From O Little Town of Bethlehem, one of those carols we love so well. You may know it was written by Philip Brooks, who was a pastor in Boston. But and it's not hard. It's not hard to think of fondly the eternal light of God shining at a ramshackle manger in Bethlehem on a cold winter's night, Mary cradling the baby in her arms. Who doesn't hope to celebrate this birth? Especially when it seems hope is in short supply nowadays. But fears? Oh my, it seems like we're just brimming with fears. It's just getting ramped up. The fire on fear is getting stoked. We do have fears. But what does fear have to do with Christmas? The history, you know, we just talked about the bells of Christmas being written during the Civil War. The little town of Bethlehem was written in 1868. Well, the Civil War had been over for 3 years. You know, Lee and Grant, they had gotten together at Appomattox. They'd signed the peace treaty. They'd shaken hands on the deal. And yes, battle-weary veterans on both sides had laid down their arms and trudged home. But half the nation was still in ruins. Andrew Jackson was president, and you know, many historians are now calling him notoriously the worst president the nation has ever seen. He was busily trying to do his best to dismantle the rights that had been won for the former slaves at such a terrible human cost. And on the home front, North and South families had been decimated by the carnage of the most brutal war America has ever known. Wives and mothers counted themselves lucky if their husband or boy came home only missing an arm or leg or perhaps an eye, or maybe just shivering with PTSD. They knew he could have not come home at all. In 1868, it gave Americans some comfort to picture humble Bethlehem stable as a place where hope and fear would come together and meet each other. And where hope would be the ultimate victor. You know, we could say, hey, we're not as bad off as those in Jerusalem who were hauled off in exile to Babylon. It's not like we're under occupation, like in Jesus' day when the Roman army occupied Israel. And it certainly seems to be better than during the Civil War. But even if we don't live in such a fearful, troubling times, we haven't gotten beyond our fears. We've learned new things to be fearful about. We still have our troubles. We're still pushed so hard sometimes that we are tempted just to give up hope. So long after Brooks put pen to paper to describe those silent stars floating over Bethlehem's deep and dreamless sleep, we still yearn for abiding peace. A peace that is a freedom from fear. And then we get John the Baptist. Well, it wouldn't be Advent if you didn't have John the Baptist popping in, but boy, you know, that little sermon he preached, you know, he starts off with, "You brood of vipers," and then he gets down to, "Even now, the axe is laying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that doesn't produce good fruit is thrown in the fire." Boy, is that cringeworthy enough for you? Oh. So far from delivering comfort and consolation, John's prophecy is calculated to disturb, to shake up, to get people to say, oh my goodness, what should I do? And yet, it is as much a part of the church's Advent proclamation as a message of comfort and peace. Christians are, we're used to saying, oh, look in the Old Testament, that's where we're going to find judgment, that's where we're going to find condemnation, but then we can turn to the New Testament and find comfort and peace. And this time it seems like that just got flopped over. Luke is trafficking in fear, while Zephaniah's passage sounds like a note of triumphant hope. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall not fear disaster no more. If we are to turn fear into hope, anxiety into joy, we have to look and say, what is God going to do? What is God about to do? We're not coming to church to say, hey, what did God do in the past? Well, maybe that helps, because it tells us what God has been doing. But we are here because we are still waiting to see what God is going to do. Waiting expectantly, hopefully. It can be difficult to hold on to the messianic hope of peace on earth in a world where people are more easily stirred up. It is so much easier to go stir up hatred and divisiveness rather than love. Each year, Daniel Dyke writes, each year we watch the news as people, Christian people, gather in Bethlehem to mark Christmas. To mark Christmas in the place where Jesus was born. And we watch as armed soldiers mingle with the crowd outside the church. We see body searches, metal detectors, security booths. And fortunately, there have been no major acts of violence marring the celebration of Christmas in Bethlehem for a number of years. But those security measures have stopped some acts of violence. Isn't it a shame, Dyke says, in conclusion, that the main concern in Bethlehem on Christmas is there might be acts of violence or terrorism on the night they honor the birth of Christ in the place they believe the Prince of Peace was born. Yeah. It does make you think. There's an article in the Week magazine a few years ago about the tragedy of the ethnic cleansing in Rwanda. 1994. Rwanda was ripped apart by civil war between the Hutu and Tutsi tribes. You may remember it's probably been the last generation's worst genocide. Rwandan citizens dispatched by war, fleeing being murdered into refugee camps where starvation and disease would wipe out thousands of people each day. And the United Nations sent a peacekeeping group, and it was led by Commander Romero Dallaire of Canada. And Dallaire's most pressing task was to stop the two tribes from fighting with one another. And it was an epic failure. None of the United Nations countries wanted to send enough peacekeeping forces that they could keep the two sides apart. And the fighting went on. The hopelessness of the situation broke Romero Dallaire's spirits. You know how the news has some of those "where are they now" stories? So in the year 2000, Canadian journalists went to track Romero down, and they found him living in a public park in Canada. As one of the journalists described it, Dallaire was blind drunk and screaming, "Somebody kill me." Was it despair over the futility of finding peace for Rwanda that drove Romero Dallaire mad? If so, he would not be the first person to declare that peace is hopeless in a fallen world. Peace is elusive on planet Earth. It is true. It's elusive in our families. It's elusive between nations. It's elusive even in our own minds and hearts. How can that peace for which the world so desperately longs, how can we find that peace which transcends all understanding in just one place? One place, right? Jesus the Christ. Peace only comes through Jesus. But we don't get to light the pink candle. We don't get to sing about Christmas joy by detouring around fear. We get there, as Philip Brooks knew, only by allowing our hopes and fears of all the years to meet one another in that little town of Bethlehem. So who would advance such a crazy idea that seems to be so out of step with everything else that is going on all around us? A Christian would. A Christian who believes God's promises and knows them to be true. In this life, there are things to be feared. There are. There's no doubt about it. If we do not fear the worst outcomes in human life, illness, poverty, pain, suffering, all the rest, we're just sticking our head in the sand. We're Pollyannas, we'd be considered foolish. Yet both Zephaniah and John are telling us good news. They're telling us that all these fears that we have are ultimately nothing when they're laid beside the plans that God has for this world and everybody that lies therein. We do hope because we know what God will still do. Leonard Sweet tells a story about a Native American tribe. And this tribe had a unique way of training their young braves. On the night of each boy's 13th birthday, he'd be led out into the wilderness to spend the night alone. Well, up until then, most of these braves had always been under the watchful eye and care of the elders of the tribe, their family. They'd never been out on their own. So they would be blindfolded and walked out into the wilderness in the dark. And then they could take the blindfold off, and it'd be dark, and they'd be all alone. Can you imagine that? 13? I don't know. Maybe it's a woodpecker or whatever you're hearing in the dark by yourself. It's going to seem a whole lot worse. It's going to be a long night. But eventually the young men would all eventually fall asleep. And morning would finally come. They had made it through just with whatever survival skills that they had and with the Great Spirit. And they'd rub the sleep out of their eyes and look around. And then they'd see off in the distance a lone figure. A man standing there with his bow and arrow. And for each boy, that was their dad, watching over them, weapon in hand, to keep them safe all night long. Into each human life, some fears must intrude. There are indeed times when thick darkness surrounds us and we must justifiably wonder, are we ever going to see daylight again? And yet, even in times of loneliness, maybe we should say especially in times of loneliness and despair, we are not alone. There is one who stands beside us to watch over and protect us. What do? Maybe we sleep a little easier. Maybe we hang on. No, we do hang on to hope all the time, because God does watch over and protect us. God will win in the end. The kingdom of God will come, and we will have